Japan, as conservative and organized as it may be, is no exception when it comes to the existence of juvenile crime, which actually saw a significant rise in the land of the rising sun from the 1950s up until the 1970s in particular. So much so that a form of organized crime crept its way into a place that should be a safe space for future generations: high school. Bullies who take your lunch money and small groups of delinquents can be found in pretty much every school worldwide. But in early post-war Japan, these fairly harmless crimes were taken to a new level. Well, at least in terms of scale and organization. Violence, intimidation, and theft were the bread and butter of the BANCHŌ and SUKEBAN groups of young Japanese delinquents who managed to strike an interesting balance between being an innocent student and being part of an actual gang. Today, we take a look at the rise of youth delinquency in post-war Japan, the gang-like structures that found their way into schools, and the impact that the BANCHŌ and SUKEBAN ended up having on pop culture. If you end up enjoying this video, then please don't forget to leave a like and subscribe if you want more Japanese crime and history content. If you're particularly impressed with my work, then feel free to check out my Patreon page, where you can support the production of future videos for as little as $1 per month. Now, without any further ado, this is the history of the BANCHŌ and SUKEBAN, Japan's delinquent school gangs. September 22nd, 1950. A vehicle containing a total of 1.9 million yen in cash, the salary for over 100 employees of Tokyo University, is on its way back to campus when suddenly a 19-year-old university co-worker named Yamagiwa Hiroyuki forces the car to pull over. Yamagiwa takes out a knife, slashes the neck of one employee while forcing the others to exit the vehicle before taking off with the 1.9 million yen. 2 days later, Yamagiwa, along with his girlfriend and accomplice, was caught, but not before spending around 200,000 yen of the stolen money, some of which was spent on a brand new suit and a hat. My man was in trouble, but at least he looked good. When the police came to arrest the two, Yamagiwa actually made a desperate, last-ditch attempt to convince the police officers that he was, in fact, not the guy that they were looking for, but an innocent Japanese-American citizen. Problem was, his English skills were subpar at best. And so he uttered the only phrase which came to mind. "Oh, mistake." The aptly named "Oh mistake" incident immediately made headlines across Japan, while the phrase "Oh mistake" itself became one of the most widespread buzzwords of Japan in the early 1950s. But why? After all, during the difficult, early post-war era of Japan that was plagued with violence and poverty, much more severe and brutal crimes were committed on a regular basis. However, it was this case that sparked a huge debate among the Japanese public, a debate that stemmed from the manner in which the robbery was carried out, and by whom it was carried out. Yamagiwa was around 14 years old when Japan surrendered to the Allied forces. He witnessed the war itself, the defeat, as well as the beginning of the subsequent occupation by the US, a culturally vastly different country. And now, while still being basically a young kid, he was stealing large sums of money and pretending to be half American in an attempt to save his own skin, all without a shred of regret or remorse. To many, the "Oh mistake" incident was emblematic of a larger problem. Frustration, poverty, and confusion caused by a rapid shift in culture and politics were widespread, and that same shift in culture was now blamed for a rapid rise of youth delinquency. Whether or not this shift in culture and the American occupation were actually to blame or not is incredibly tough to answer. Crime among teenagers was on the rise not only in Japan, but worldwide. The fact that Japan was on the losing side of the war might have amplified this problem quite a bit though, and the numbers were indeed pretty noteworthy. Before the war, the average number of crimes committed by under 19-year-olds over a 5-year period sat at around 48,000. The 5-year period after the war saw this number go up to a staggering 126,000. More worryingly, the number of juvenile crimes in Japan not only failed to decrease, it actually went up, reaching a peak in the early 1960s. Crimes carried out by individuals also became increasingly rare, with crimes committed in groups growing more and more popular among the Japanese youth. In Japan, junior high school is the final step of compulsory education, preceded by 6 years of primary school. Junior high students are between 12 to 15 years old, an age that I think many of us can confirm is generally very problematic. It's no surprise then that junior high would also become a hotspot for groups of young delinquents, with students from lower class families who usually stopped attending school after junior high being very susceptible to committing crimes. Some of these troublemakers managed to stand out though. Japanese school gangs started forming around the strongest student in junior high, who received the title BANCHŌ, a title that is thought to have originated from a position of the same name inside the Japanese Imperial Guard between the 8th and 10th century. While murder, human trafficking and the likes were not on the crime curriculum of the BANCHŌ, the way that their gangs were organized is actually quite interesting, and in some ways pretty similar to their more violent, adult counterparts like the Yakuza. The BANCHŌ were probably the closest thing to adolescent kingpins in Japan at the time. So what were these gangs actually up to? Well, overall, nothing that wouldn't happen in any school outside of Japan. The crimes of the gangs surrounding the BANCHŌ were fairly harmless, in most cases. Intimidation and theft were a regular occurrence, but so was violence against members, but mostly against non-members of the group. What made the BANCHŌ gangs stand out, however, was the high degree of organization found within these groups. Every year, in either September or October, a secret election took place where the next BANCHŌ would be chosen. In order to find a successor, the reigning BANCHŌ would organize a fight which took place on the school grounds where everyone got to show off their strength to the other students. The strongest of them all usually won the election, with 4 or 5 other strong students becoming his subordinate lieutenants. The rank of BANCHŌ was usually held by one of the older students, but every now and then, a boy from a lower grade would prove to be particularly aggressive and strong. In that case, he would receive the honor of becoming a sort of sub-BANCHŌ, which might give him a big advantage by the time the next election rolls around. One of my main sources, a book titled Heritage of Endurance, also mentions a meticulously planned, well-organized scheme carried out by a BANCHŌ leader who ordered his subordinates to go out and extract money from other students for some sort of gang project. Japan just knows how to take things to the next level, even if it's about taking your lunch money. The size of these gangs varied, of course, depending on how large the school was. The aforementioned source mainly investigated schools located in Tokyo's Arakawa ward, where enrollment ranged from 700 to 1,000 students. The BANCHŌ in these schools usually controlled gangs which contained anywhere from 20 up to 60 students. Doesn't sound like all that much, but it was certainly enough to cause other students a fair amount of trouble. But actually, violence at the hands of these well-organized delinquents wasn't reserved exclusively for students. At times, even teachers could become the victim of a BANCHŌ and his men. Or his boys, I should say. An interview with 3 former BANCHŌ gang members gives us some insight into why exactly there were occasional physical altercations between students and teachers. Quote, "There are 2 types of teachers. One group of teachers is understanding towards the kids. The other group is old-fashioned and rigid. The former is popular among the kids. The latter is hated. A school teacher must be willing to talk frankly with his boys. Some teachers give themselves airs, as if to emphasize that teachers are a different form of existence from school kids. These guys should be punished, otherwise they do harm to less aggressive kids. When some boys don't behave well in the classroom, perhaps they want to show off their authority to other kids. They say, 'Come outside, I will punish you.' Young teachers, fresh out of college, don't want to be beaten up by the boys, and in order to avoid such problems, they decide to scare the boys first. They act strictly. They are making a great mistake. Their efforts simply make the boys more rebellious against them. Those teachers who are disliked by the boys are poor teachers who do not know how to handle the boys properly. The kids are all very simple-minded after all. Therefore, if the teachers can communicate with them, soul to soul, person to person, the kids will all obey them. But now I am grateful to those stubborn, rigid, and bad teachers, because they taught me that the world is not made up of my friends. Thanks to them, I learned that there are enemies as well as friends in this world." End quote. Winning a certain sense of authority over the teachers occasionally gained the BANCHŌ and their gangs a certain amount of respect and popularity among other kids who weren't involved in that sort of business. Actually, in some cases, the BANCHŌ were kind of like celebrities inside their respective schools. One teacher recalled students paying actual money, as much as 1,000 yen, just to have their photo taken with a BANCHŌ. Such a photo would sometimes provide a kid with more than just bragging rights at school. Showing them to members of the gang and claiming to be close friends with the leader would in some cases be an effective way of protecting oneself against being attacked or robbed of that precious lunch money. The gang's weapons of choice when it came to combat on school grounds were their own fists, but when things got serious outside of school, objects like bike chains, wooden swords, and steel pipes were often utilized. Sometimes, you'd even have competing schools fighting each other, which, I know, sounds like something straight out of an anime, but apparently it's true. The bancho of the losing side of such a battle between two schools often became a quote-unquote disciple of the victorious banjo, which could also result in a merger of the two competing gangs. Reportedly, there were members of actual Yakuza gangs who gave food and lodging for several nights at a time to banjo leaders who ran away from home. There honestly seems to have been no clear-cut connection between banjo and the Yakuza, but seeing that both groups are usually made up in large parts of social outcasts and/or people from lower-class families, former banjo eventually joining an actual Yakuza or Bozozoku gang does kinda make sense. The banjo didn't manage to stick around for too long. Generally, it is thought that their time came to an end sometime during the 1970s. Their spirit, however, was kept alive by a group of young delinquents that was formed at around the same time by those who were not allowed to join the banjo gangs. Why were they not allowed to join? Well, because they were girls. And if the boys wouldn't let them join, their best option was to just form groups of rebellious delinquents themselves. Groups that would actually manage to become much larger than those which were composed exclusively of male students. These exclusively female delinquent gangs would eventually receive the name Sukeban, and just like their male counterparts, they created their own style, which allowed them to distinguish themselves from all the other students. Most notably, they altered their school uniforms by making the skirt much longer, sometimes decorating them with kanji and slogans. Kind of similar to the biker jackets of the Bozozoku, the lengthening of the skirt was more than just a stylistic choice, though. Motivated by a growing Japanese feminist movement that started gaining traction starting in the 1960s, a long skirt sort of represented a protest against the miniskirt that had become a part of the school uniform. A longer skirt was also pretty useful when it came to hiding weapons at school, the most popular of which were chains and razor blades, used to commit a similar set of crimes as the bancho gangs, namely theft, as well as violence against other students and rival gangs. And just like the bancho gangs, they had a rigid hierarchy and followed a pretty strict set of rules. Disrespecting a superior or stealing another girl's boyfriend, for example, would result in punishment. A popular way of doing so was by burning the offender with a cigarette, which was actually considered to be one of the less painful types of punishment, reserved only for minor offenses. At their peak during the 1970s, tens of thousands of girls across Japan were thought to be part of the Sukeban gang. The largest of these gangs, the Kanto Women Delinquent Alliance, reportedly boasted a membership of around 20,000 members, which would have put them well above the country's biggest Yakuza gangs. Maybe not in terms of power, money, or influence, but definitely in terms of sheer membership numbers. Pretty impressive. The Sukeban's influence on common culture is also pretty hard to overstate. The style of the Sukeban became iconic. A whole subgenre of movies inspired by Sukeban called pinky violence became all the rage in Japan during the 1970s. These action movies offered viewers a new type of badass, violent female protagonist that hadn't really been seen in Japanese cinema up until that point. For something even more mainstream, look no further than anime and manga, like 1975's Sukeban Deca series, which also spawned multiple TV shows and movies over a span of almost 4 decades. Takeuchi Naoko, creator of the world-famous Sailor Moon series, was inspired by the Sukeban style, while her husband gave some of the characters in his own manga series, Yu Yu Hakusho, a look that was undoubtedly inspired by the banjo. These are just a few of countless examples of banjo and Sukeban finding their way into popular Japanese media, but even the West couldn't quite escape the unique style of Japan's young delinquents. Quentin Tarantino's Kill Bill Volume 1 features a Sukeban-inspired character named Gogo Yubari, a 17-year-old Japanese high school student and assassin who basically kills for fun. Tarantino is known to be a huge fan of Asian cinema, so I guess there's a good chance that he watched a few pinky violence movies himself at some point. That skirt on Gogo Yubari might actually be a bit too short for a real Sukeban though. Oh, and apparently there's a Japanese female pro wrestling league called Sukeban, which made research for this video a bit more difficult than it needed to be. Nowadays, the entertainment industry is pretty much the only place where the spirit of the banjo and Sukeban somehow lives on. Youth delinquency in Japan is obviously still a thing and always will be, though definitely not as much as in the 60s and 70s. It's all just a lot less organized and big scale compared to half a century ago. The number of juvenile crimes in Japan has fortunately been on a steep decline during the past decade especially, with only 16,000 reported cases in 2021, down from 47,000 in 2012. Compare that to the numbers of the 60s or the 70s, and it's pretty obvious why there simply isn't really a place for large-scale quote-unquote organized crime in Japanese schools anymore, even with things like bullying unfortunately still posing a huge problem. Regardless, it's kind of interesting to see that the hierarchies and social structures that seemingly find their way into every nook and cranny of Japanese society could once also be found among groups of underage junior high school students looking to cause a bit of trouble. Which Japanese criminal organizations or subcultures would you like to see next? Let me know in the comments down below. I also want to thank all of my Patreon supporters listed here, including Busner, who actually suggested the Sukeban as a topic and gave me the idea to make this entire video. And to everyone who stuck around until the end, as always, thank you so much for watching. Sayonara.